What is up, weather enthusiasts? I'm your host, Pat's Path Predictor. Let's get right into the weather. Alright, well, this is going to be a bit of a different video for you guys today. As advertised in yesterday's video, we have an interview with Weather Kingdom. Weather Kingdom, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, to be honest. And how are you, Pat?
I'm doing pretty good. You ready to get into it?
I'm ready.
Alright,
Very ready to discuss.
All right, perfect. So the first thing I wanted to bring up is I wanted to kind of get through some conditions with you before we get into the main stuff of the video that I really want to get into. And I want to go ahead and first start very quickly. I want to get your opinions on a few conditions like sea surface temperatures, ocean heat content, wind shear, and the moisture before we dive into some more of the favorable conditions that we could be seeing going forward. So let's go ahead and get started, and let's go ahead and start with the sea surface temperatures. So this is the map I have pulled up for you. You can see it on the Discord on my screen and all of that. This is the map as of the Atlantic as of June 24th, 2025. As you can see, we're seeing quite a lot of warming in the Gulf region as well as parts of the Atlantic basin. Overall, what's your take on what you've been seeing with the water temperatures, and what do you think is going to be happening going forward?
So already in the Gulf, you can already see we are starting to see 30 to 31 degrees Celsius. And I do think that 31 to 30 degrees Celsius will continue to expand, not just along the coast, but deep in the ocean, with the ocean heat content, when we do look at that. But especially off the coast of the Atlantic and even Northeast is much warmer. And I do think tropical activity will be very favorable this year, very far north, especially even closer to the Northeast. How high the ocean heat content will be, especially as we get into September and July. The main development region had a slower start than previous years with the warming of the water, but we're seeing that bound very quickly with already 28 degrees Celsius. And I do expect the water temperatures to warm rapidly, especially as we get into the later months of the hurricane season.
All right. Thank you very much for your quick analysis on that. Um, I want to quickly follow up on you. In terms of what we're seeing in the Atlantic basin, what's your take on this, considering we're seeing 26 degrees Celsius water temperatures from the warming up period area just north of the subtropics, pretty much matching and pretty much connecting with the Gulf Stream? That's pretty interesting, and I wanted your opinion on this.
To be honest with you, what that means is we're going to have any storms that go up the East Coast is going to even have a better time with the water temperatures, especially like when you look back in the early 2000s. Water temperatures wasn't this warm, and over the last few decades, we have seen a rapid increase, especially farther and farther north with the water temperatures. And that all that just means is more tropical cyclones and more stronger storms further north, and that will lead into a busier subtropical season, I do think, especially as the early months and the later months of the Atlantic hurricane season.
Right. Okay, so next thing I want to pull up very quickly is the ocean heat content, which is essentially, in layman's terms for the audience, how warm the water is and how deep down it goes. In terms of OHC, what do you think is going to happen, and what have the results in your mind been like so far?
The results, how it's been honestly the last few years, last year compared to this year, a little bit, once again, less of ocean heat content. That's because we had a pretty active season, a very weird season, that weird July break, and then an kind of an active late season peak. We had a few storms in the Caribbean that took the OHC down a bit, but we are already regaining that very quickly, and especially as we get into August and September. I do think we'll be about near 150 OHC widespread. And then in the same thing in the main development region, I think that will continue to expand. And deep in, same thing with the off the coast with the Gulf Stream. And I don't know if it's weird to me, but I feel that that Gulf Stream has gotten closer and closer and warmer and further north to the Atlantic seaboard in the Northeast in the last, I would say, 5 years.
Yeah.
In the Gulf of Mexico too, we have that loop current, very, very deep, warm temperatures. We usually see rapid intensification in the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean, and I do expect another season where we can have the conditions are just right. I do think we are going to have a lot of issues, especially if we get a strong storm that rides into the Caribbean and then Gulf of Mexico
All right.
for the
Thank.
U.S.
Yeah, absolutely. We do not want to see that. They had, I believe, 5 landfalls, hurricanes last year with Beryl, Debbie, Francine, Helene, and Milton. So we definitely don't
Right.
need any more in the Gulf region this time. Next thing I want to bring up with you is the wind shear because I've been noticing it with the models. We're looking at it right now. The wind shear really starts to take a nosedive across much of the Atlantic over the next few days, and then it becomes a bit more of a fluctuative pattern where before we had one concentrated area of high wind shear around the tropics, and then it just fluctuates, goes up, and then it goes down, then it goes up, and then it goes down. What's your thoughts on the wind shear patterns going into July, and kind of what's your take on how these will continue?
I think it's going to be honestly a different ball game as we get into the later seasons. Usually in the beginning months of the Atlantic hurricane season, the Caribbean is always known with the trade winds, and it's usually very strong winds that keep tropical development. It's usually called the dead zone for June and July. But I do think as we continue to go on, the shear will die down. And one thing I notice is the shear in the Gulf is very limited as we get into the early parts of July and into the later parts, especially in the main development region. I do think that's just going to be another reason why I'm thinking, and a lot of other people are thinking, that it's going to be a pretty active hurricane season for this. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So thank you for that. Last thing I want to bring up is the moisture because, in my opinion, and I'm sure yours as well, shear is not going to be the really factor as to what's the fail safe for the month of July. It's going to be the Sahara air layer. It's going to be the dry air. What's your take on the dry air patterns we have noticed, and what's your thoughts on how these tropical waves can potentially get past the Sahara air layer to potentially cause some development going forward?
I think how it's been ready a slow I wouldn't say a slow start. To people it might be because we always were used to storms in May and a lot of storms to just start off and then we get that break. This is more of that traditional year, and one thing from last year to this year is yeah, we do have a lot of dry air, but last year we had a much worse Saharan dust layer. And I do think as we get into the later parts of mid July into the early August, I do think the dry air will relax a bit, especially right there that you have pulled up as we get into
This is July
later
8th.
portions of like
Yeah.
as we get into July 8th, July 10th, you can see that Saharan dust really relax, especially on the last frames. We got a very large tropical wave coming off the Atlantic of the
The African
uh,
coast.
African coast, yes. And then you can especially see by this time we have very limited dry air, and that to me is much different than last year when we had that massive plume all the way into beginning of August.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I've been watching it as well, looking at the precipitable water anomalies too. Definitely showing a more moist environment than last year from what I've noticed. Um, okay. So let's go ahead and get into the main meat of what we were going to discuss, and that is the slideshow that you have created that we're going to go ahead and present. I have it pulled up on my screen. So basically, this is the first one I wanted to show. This is pretty much for those watching. This is pretty much your divergence, aloft or convergence aloft. The green is more divergence. The orange slash red is more convergence, and that is kind of indicative of where the Madden-Julian oscillation or MJO sits. So MJO is typically more of a favorable pattern for tropical development. That's pretty much the general gist of it. But the reason I wanted to bring Weather Kingdom on is because he brought these charts to my attention, and he also looked at this, especially for mid to late July in the Atlantic. And Weather Kingdom, the best way you can, please explain to the audience why we're so looking at these charts and kind of why we're so concerned with this time frame because of this pattern.
First off, we look at the MJO because it's a very big part of the Atlantic hurricane season. People might think it's just about the waters and the ocean heat content, and no, it's really not. When it comes to the hurricane season, it's like when you're cooking, you need all the ingredients, and if you're missing one ingredient, that could play a very big role of development in the Atlantic hurricane season. And one thing is the MJO. It's the Madden-Julian oscillation. He kind of already explain that, and it's the divergence in the Atlantic and around the world. So in the red is unfavorable conditions. That means we have sinking motion. The green, we have rising motion, and as we see in the early parts of July and the end of June, there's an unfavorable Madden-Julian oscillation across the Atlantic Ocean. That will continue into about is that probably around like July 5th or so. We start seeing the uprising motion start entering the Caribbean, Gulf of Mexico, and Eastern Atlantic. As we get into later July, towards the second half to last week of July, you can really see a spike in the green, especially across the Gulf of Mexico, Caribbean, and Atlantic Ocean. And one thing too, as we look in there, North Africa, we do see an unfavorable period around that time, but we're going to be seeing a lot of waves coming off Africa. In the Atlantic side, it will be very favorable. Then we start seeing once again another favorable period as we go into August, and I do think August we will be in a very favorable pattern. The pattern we've been in has been an unfavorable pattern with the MJO, and that's probably a reason why we haven't had too much to talk about in the Atlantic Ocean, because we had a lot of sinking motion across the Atlantic, and we kind of got in this MJO pattern where everything was stuck, and we kind of had the uprising motion in the Eastern Pacific, and that's why you had all those storms in June. And as we go into later July, I do think the favorability will enter the Atlantic. So with warm waters, good OHC, and now a favorable MJO towards the end of July or mid-July to August, that's just another reason why we are thinking it's going to be a much more active period than we have seen in June.
All right. Thank you very much. Now I'm gonna pull up these next couple of slides and kind of merge these together a little bit, if that's okay. So you have in your slides that you've
Yeah.
been kind of looking at some Kelvin waves and an increase in vorticity from the European starting around July 10th. And on this slide, you have the CFS model that's indicating multiple low pressure systems across the Atlantic, across the MDR, and in the Gulf region. What's your thoughts, and kind of explain to the audience why you're so concerned with with the charts that you've been noticing, and kind of explain to the audience why you're so concerned and why you highlighted this?
I highlighted this because, yes, we don't really use the CFS because it's a much longer range model, and I like to look at it when it comes to the hurricane season because it gives us a general understanding of how the conditions could be. It's not completely right. And in that image, yeah, you see multiple tropical waves. I'm telling you right now, that is probably not going to end up being like that. But what that tells me is we're going to have a favorable MJO, favorable waters, and we're going to have the chance of favorable precipitation across the main development region into the Atlantic. And clearly, that shows quite a few tropical waves as we get into the last few weeks of July into early August. So, that right there tells me now the models are slowly picking up on it. And with the Euro, if you can go back to the Euro, you could tell we do have a couple Kelvin wave. A couple Kelvin wave is pretty much a massive wave of moisture and spin that comes off Africa into the main development region. We usually see that as we get into July, and clearly right there around July 10th or so, we do see a wave come off Africa, and it's a pretty large wave. Sometimes, if the conditions are just right, we do get tropical development out of these. But with this time and go around, I think it's more of to get the Atlantic more favorable and get the vorticity going. And I think we're going to be seeing a much stronger blooms of moisture and vorticity as we get into July. And we're going to notice it and look back at it from June. We're going to see a lot more vorticity. And I do think with the couple Kelvin wave, that's just going to help to get the conditions all right for the Atlantic basin as we get into later July into August.
All right. Thank you very much for that. Next thing we want to show, and Weather Kingdom was really concerned about this, is the SST anomalies he's been noticing from NOAA, not just across parts of the Gulf and the Mid-Atlantic, but also the main development region, the Caribbean, all of that stuff. Could you express to the audience why you're so concerned with these patterns and what this could mean for tropical development?
Yes. If you can just go back to the other first slide.
Right here.
So I highlighted a major portion of, once again, the North Atlantic. And that is very concerning because we have seen that a lot, and we've seen that get worse and worse. And now we're seeing 3 to 6 degrees Celsius above average, and especially in that Gulf Stream. And that from last year, I'll try and find some information on that with last year's time of right now to this year. We notice a much more of a push of the Gulf Stream, especially closer into the Northeast, and especially just right off the Northeast coast. So that means if any tropical wave goes in that region, we are going to probably see some development. And honestly, the Northeast is due for a tropical cyclone. And I do think this is concerning because, especially in that region, when Hurricane Sandy happened, the waters were much colder. And now, if we have a Hurricane Sandy or any tropical cyclone that rides the eastern seaboard, right in these conditions, as we get into later months, the conditions will be favorable. And I do think we could be talking about a much more large issue into the Northeast, into the Maine, and up in across the Atlantic Ocean. Much stronger storms and probably less colder waters. Okay.
Yeah.
And as we look into the Gulf of Mexico, I did highlight in black, especially near the Florida's Panhandle coast and the Louisiana coast, we are running about 3 to 4 degrees above average, and I do expect that to worsen over the next few weeks. Then we take a broader look into parts of the Bahamas, the main development region, the Caribbean, and the Gulf of Mexico. We are looking at a general 1 to 2 degrees above average, and we do have a little slice there of blue. That's about 0 to about -1 degrees, and I do think that will warm up in the next few weeks.
Okay.
Now let's just take a look at the main development region. So we take a look at the main development region, and I highlight, there's a lot of colors here. So I'm just going to start out near Europe. Europe is not a big thing we really need to talk about, but this is pretty important for them because we could see tropical cyclones that take that quick curve and remnants of lows that could hit Europe. They're running about 2 to 4 degrees above average. Okay, that's
Wow.
very important because yeah, they are running about 2 to 4 degrees above average. Very important, especially once again I highlighted that 3 to 6. This is a little bit more in the North Atlantic side of it. We're still running 3 to 6 degrees above average, and probably even in some spots closer to 7 degrees Celsius above average. And yes, there is blue in there that is running about 3 to 5 degrees below average, but that's because it's the Gulf Stream and it's more warmer than colder. And we've continued to see the Gulf Stream warming in the last few years. Then we take a look at the general area of that 1 to 2 degrees Celsius, and that covers the main development region where we usually see tropical activity. That tells me that we have a lot of moisture, that when the moisture comes, the less wind shear, favorable MJO, we're going to have a very favorable Atlantic waters. Then we take a look at the blue, and there's a little spot of 1 to 2 degrees below average, in between of the 3 to 6 and 2 to 4. That's not too much. That's more in the subtropics. Then we take a area off North Africa. That's running about 1 to 2 degrees below average. And that's pretty much the reason of that dry air in Saharan dust. Usually that will warm later in the months, and I do expect it to warm as the dry air starts relaxing. Then the last area is that 2 to 4 south of the area, and we've seen this in the last few years. That's for 2 to 4 degrees below average, and that usually means um where all the moisture develops. I forget the exact name of it, but where all the moisture develops for the main development region this time of month will be north of that. So when you make that north of that, that does go right into the main development region, and it will be less tropical activities farther south. So much more of a northern push with the moisture this go around.
So this concentrates the tropical activity more so in the MDR and not further north or south of
Correct.
it. So briefly, before we end this interview, I want you to talk about this because you mentioned some analogs that you brought up. Similar, you're projecting that we could see a potentially a similar season to 2017, 2011, and 1999. Very briefly, explain in a broad sense why you've come to this conclusion and just what, very quickly, what factors kind of drove you to this conclusion.
So I was looking quickly around everything, and I saw 2017, 1999, and was it 2011?
11.
Yes. So why I kind of compared to this year is because of the time frame too. So in these years, we had tropical activity early, like in June and July, non-existence, maybe 1 to 2 storms, especially in 1999. There, that so far really aligns to this hurricane season, and these hurricane seasons all have something very in common with this year: a weak La Nina to a neutral pattern. That is what we are going to be talking about as we get into the hurricane season. We're in a neutral slash weak La Nina right now. And that was one major thing. And I was taking a look at the water temps. And the water temps align with all these years. And that colder spot just south of the MDR showed up in all these analogs. So it really, the Atlantic waters really aligned with these 3 years. And I thought with the MJO and everything that I was taking a look at, it really aligns with how this hurricane season has played already so far. I do expect at least a above average hurricane season. It could play like a 1999 or a 2017 or a 2011. But that is just a little bit brief on some analogs, and I'll explain it in my video a little bit later.
All right. Thank you for coming on to the show, Weather Kingdom. We appreciate you having you on. Thanks for taking the time out of your day to explain to our audience what we're looking at and why we're so concerned about this hurricane season.
Yes, thank you. I really appreciate that. And everybody, please be safe. And please don't think that this quiet period is just something to just brush off. It's time to prepare and it's time to take action, because as we get into later months, I do think we are going to be in a pretty busy active period.
Ladies and gentlemen, that is Weather Kingdom for you. He has come on Pat's Path Predictor. His link to his channel will be the first link in the description down below. So be sure you go subscribe to him. He got a few new subs yesterday. Let's see if we can keep boosting him up, because I think he did a fantastic job on this interview. So go show him some love. Go subscribe to him. He'd really appreciate that. But with that being said, we're going to go ahead and end this interview right here. Be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you are new. The goal, as always, is to get more people engaged with weather. You can find Weather Kingdom and myself and a bunch of other people in the Storms United Discord server. The link to that is in the end screen. But with that being said, have a wonderful day, guys. Stay safe.